Hello everyone and welcome to Professor Tools. Today I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about a very basic but hugely important concept in teaching that has really enriched my teaching experience, and I think it's really made a big impact on my students as well, and I'm hoping that by sharing it this will be good for you in your classroom as well. So basically we're going to talk about something that has a very jargony title of ZPD, the Zone of Proximal Development, which sounds very impressive, but really it's quite a concrete and pragmatic concept that I think you can use in your classrooms very well. Let's begin by just going back a little bit to ski instruction, which is where I learned how to teach. And I know that's strange because, I've been a professor for so long and I've done so much of my adult life has been wrapped up in tertiary education. But the reality is just about everything I learned about teaching, I learned on the slopes. So what is it about skiing that informed my teaching so much? Let's have a look at this picture here. This is a ski instructor, and I'm sure this picture just happens to be taken at a bad moment, doesn't really capture what's going on. But if we imagine, just for the sake of argument, that this is his teaching style, then it's not working because, look at his body posture here. He's like pointing and he's like aggressively explaining, and you get the feeling that there's something negative coming across here. And if you have any questions about whether or not that's happening, look at his students. They're all leaning back from him. They're kind of scared of him. The facial expressions, except for the assistant instructor in the back there, who knows why he's smiling, but the students don't look like they are having a lot of fun on the slopes. On the other hand, take a look at this instructor and oh my gosh, this is a dynamic moment. The students are all clearly excited. It's a beautiful day. They're so happy to be out there on the snow. I mean, what is the big difference between these two instructors? I think a lot of it boils down to what's going on in this picture here. Now, the essence of ski instruction, which you might want to argue is different from classroom instruction, but I'd like to say probably not that much, is that a good ski instructor keeps the students moving. They're constantly following the instructor down the hill. The instructor is modeling how to carve those turns and constantly looking back over his or her shoulder to make sure that everyone is keeping up. And the main skill that the instructor has to master is the speed of descent down the hill. If the instructor goes too fast, the students literally cut corners and try to catch up, and then they wipe out and it's a big mess. If the student goes too slow, they pile up against each other and they get frustrated because they can't go at the speed they know how to handle. So a good instructor finds the right pace and curves at the right angles so that the students can follow behind just above where they're capable of skiing, where their skill level is. So this is basically the metaphor for Lev Vygotsky's theory known as Zone of Proximal Development. Now, for those of you who may be watching who may know a lot about educational theory, there's a huge amount of controversy over what exactly Vygotsky really meant, and we're not even going to go there. Have a look at these three quick graphs here and it'll explain what's going on. These graphs are taken from a great, very useful article, especially for tertiary education, by Rob Wass and Clinton Golding. The title is Sharpening a Tool for Teaching, the Zone of Proximal Development, and it's published in Teaching in Higher Education, Volume 19, Number 6, 2014. This is what we're trying to do with teaching. On the left side, you have the student inside a circle. The circle represents everything that the student can do prior to teaching. Everything outside of that circle, the student can't do. It's too large a task, it's too complicated, whatever. And then underneath you see a triangle. That's like the skill or the knowledge that we want the student to possess after teaching. You see the arrow slides over to the right, and after teaching, wow, look at how good we are at doing this. The circle of can do is expanded to include that triangle task that's there in the middle. There's still going to be stuff that's can't do, obviously. The student doesn't go from middle school straight up to doctoral status right away, but we have expanded the circle. That's essentially like a graphic representation of what we are hoping to achieve in a classroom. Now, how do we get there? So Vygotsky's idea is basically like this. On the left side, you see the circle with the student in the side, the things that the student can do. Okay, the triangle is underneath. And what's in that kind of outside, or the donut itself, is the zone of proximal development, meaning the place where a student is capable of learning this, can doing this, as long as they have a little bit of help. They can't do it independently. If you give them a task right now, they don't have the knowledge or the skills or the experience to know how to do it. But if you give them a little bit of information, a little bit of coaching, they will be able to do it. That area is the zone of proximal development. And then if you slide to the right, you see that now, once the student can do it independently, then that's called teaching. That's great. Now the student doesn't need you anymore. The student can simply go on and can do for him or herself. And you can, of course, then repeat with a larger zone of proximal development. The key task, however, is to understand that if you teach outside of the zone of proximal development, there's two possibilities. Either you're teaching inside the can-do circle, which will bore the student because the student already knows those things, or you're teaching way outside the zone of proximal development, meaning you're teaching too high and the student gives up, feels frustrated, feels stupid, which is the worst, and they say, I can't learn, and you've failed. So the goal of the instructor is to find where is the zone of proximal development for my student or students. It's much harder, of course, in a group, and we'll talk about that, God willing, in another installment of Professor Tools. If we bring that back to the skiing metaphor, the zone of proximal development is essentially the speed of descent down the hill. Too fast, too much for the student, they wipe out. Too slow, the students bunch up against each other, the students feel I'm not learning, and they get frustrated, they want a different instructor, or they give up skiing altogether, which would be a real terrible thing. One more graph here. This, again, is from Wass and Golding's article. On the top, you've got the zone of proximal development, and the thing about this graph is the little triangle there is just outside the donut hole, which means that once you have effectively taught, then the donut hole has expanded slightly. Very good, job well done. But on the bottom part of this graph, you see that you've gone to the star, and the star is much further outside the donut hole, still within that zone of proximal development, still within the possibility of a student learning this or managing this skill independently if they had some assistance. Then all of a sudden, wow, look at this, the student really has learned a lot. That's an incredibly successful teaching moment because the student can look back and say, oh my gosh, I remember where I was at the beginning of this semester. Look at where I am now. Look at how much more I have achieved. Not just a little tiny bit, which is great, but so much more. I am so grateful to my teacher for exposing me to this. This is the idea of the zone of proximal development, and the goal is to find the very outside limit that you can take your students to, and that's where you teach. So next steps, we're going to talk about these things in a lot more lectures, but just to give you one specific takeaway, and that is that the most important skill that an instructor can develop in working with the ZPD awareness is make sure you have a connection with your students and how they're progressing along in their learning. For example, one of the worst things you can do is turn your back to them and just, write on the board, or, God forbid, turn your back to them and read your PowerPoints aloud to them. Oh my gosh, you have to turn and face the students. You have to see what they're up to, read their body language. That's basically the idea of finding your teaching zone, finding that point where it's above what the students know, but not so far above that they will be lost in your teaching. Okay, that's it. I hope you found Professor Tools useful, and wish you tremendous success in your classroom.